I think I've always argued that astrology is inherently predictive to some extent, at the very least, that any astrologer, because astrologers have debates about this and the extent to which things are predetermined, or the extent to which astrology is predictive, or the extent to which astrology should be used for prediction, and whether that's helpful, because there's been a split in modern times between psychological astrologers who want to use astrology primarily as a helpful tool within the context of counseling or psychology, and therefore making predictions is not necessarily the best use of it in that context, and instead they're just using it as an additional lens or additional angle in order to help people from a counseling standpoint. But there's other astrologers that focus more on the potential of astrology being predictive, and if it is predictive, how far they can take that and what they can do with it, or the perception that making predictions is the only way that we'll ever legitimize astrology to the public or in a scientific context or what have you, so that it becomes their mission to try to do it that way. In my view, I think astrology is inherently predictive, because if the basic premise of natal astrology is that the alignment of the planets at the moment a person is born has anything to say about a person's future character or events that will happen at some point in their life, then that means in the basic premise there is some underlying assumption that it has some predictive potential, even in the most like restricted sense. So therefore, yeah, I think astrology is inherently predictive.
Great. And so can you give me any specific examples of how this sort of mundane or predictive astrology has functioned in recent years? Like, for instance, were astrologers able to see COVID coming?
Yeah, there was a French astrologer named Andre Barbeau who, because one of the issues in doing different types of predictions is how astrologers make predictions primarily is by paying attention to astrological correlations as they're happening, and going back and studying past events when there's been a specific planetary alignment, and then what events occurred in the world at the time of those planetary alignments. And then they project that out in the future and say, well, if this planetary alignment coincided with this in the past, then by extension, when this planetary alignment reoccurs in the future, it should coincide with a similar event, right? So there's different astrologers, though, that have different interests or different specialties in terms of what type of events they want to go back in the past and study, or the extent to which a person has gone back and studied historical events in the past, because one of the points is that like not everybody is a historian. Like you actually have to have a genuine interest in history, or studying biographies, or studying different phases of human history, different types of events, in order to like go out of your way to study certain things. So all of that is a preface to say there was a French astrologer named Andre Barbeau who was very well known and very well regarded for his work in mundane astrology, which is making predictions about world events as well as studying historical alignments and events in the past. And he had made a specific study about the astrology of pandemics. So what he said, though, is he went back and he studied a bunch of planetary alignments in the past. And I have this quote from him. This was in an article that he wrote in 2012. And what was interesting about Andre Barbeau is that he actually died in 2019. So he died before the pandemic occurred. And he made this statement, this prediction in a specific article where he studied pandemics and the astrology of pandemics historically in past alignments. And he went back and looked at different ones. So what he said, and let me see if I can share this. This is from a previous episode that we did at one point, I think in 2020, talking about his predictions. But he said, quote, "Going back to the pandemics and going back to the past century, the four crises of 1918, 1954, 1968, and 1982 are obvious. And the two considerable being the first, the famous Spanish flu, which is said to have claimed 25 million lives, and the last one in AIDS, which is even more devastating and continues to be deadly. Since then, there's also been a small influenza surge in 2009 against the last lowest cyclical index of 2010. We may be in serious danger of a new pandemic at the 2020 through 2021 mark, at the lowest peak of the cyclic index of the 21st century, with the quintet of outer planets gathering over 100 degrees, a conjunction of Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto can be more specifically, this is translated from French, so that's why the English is a little rough. And he continues, he says, and even specifically lend itself to the tissue of this imbalance. Nonetheless, this configuration can also transfer its core of dissonances to the terrain of geophysical disasters, which ultimately sparing the international affairs scene, nature, and society being indiscriminately affected. So, yeah, I mean, there are, if an astrologer like studied the history really closely and went back and compared previous pandemics, then one astrologer who did that, who was reputable, did issue a statement ahead of time about COVID. So that would be a recent instance of something like that.
That's really quite impressive. And generally among the astrological community, was there a sense that we were kind of heading up for some kind of disaster, even if we weren't quite sure what it was going to be?
Yeah. I mean, on the podcast, one of the funny things was on my podcast, when we did our year ahead forecast, one of our funny things was, you know, we're sometimes trying to relate this to people's lives and how individuals are going to experience it. And so one of the things we said in our year ahead forecast that we recorded in November of 2019, when we were talking about March of 2020, is, you know, we made a joke about it at the time, but that ended up being like weirdly prescient. But we said there will be no hugging in the third week of March of 2020. And we were sort of like joking and laughing about it in that context, that just like there was a huge, what you might classically think of when you're thinking about astrology, of just an alignment of planets all in the same spot in the sky that looked very difficult. And one of the primary things is that it was a conjunction of Saturn and Pluto. And the last time that Saturn and Pluto were conjoined, for example, was in the early 1980s, which was around the time of really the widespread sort of understanding of the AIDS epidemic and things like that. So you had sort of a recurrence of the same thing. And yeah, that was one of the ways that we sort of talked about it ahead of time at the time. But if you go back and listen to astrologers in their 2020 predictions, you'll understand that most astrologers were concerned about it being, you know, kind of a tough year just in general. But different astrologers also have different approaches to like how you should talk about what look like negative or difficult things coming up, frankly, because astrologers get worried, especially psychological astrologers get worried about the negative psychological impact of making bad predictions about the future. Because most astrologers are actually concerned about like the psychological well-being and saying things that are going to be helpful and things that are going to be productive, rather than just like freaking people out, or rather than doing something that's going to have a negative psychological impact on people. So one of the, for me, from like a philosophical perspective, things that was interesting about 2020 a little bit was seeing the other side of that, which is that for so much of the late 20th century, psychological astrologers focused so much on doing no harm with astrology and not making negative statements in astrology, even when things looked bad, that in 2020, we sort of saw the opposite side of that, which is that if you don't say what you see and if you hold back too much, then you're going to get the opposite side of that, which is that people are going to turn around and say, why didn't you say how bad this was going to be? Or you didn't predict this or something like that, when that might not be necessarily the case. So it was an interesting, I think, as a community thing that was sort of learned about the other side of that after several decades of the community going in the other side of just trying to be productive and helpful and do no harm. But it was kind of like the other side of, if you can do harm by leaving things out or by not being as explicit as you could be, perhaps.